is one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries, and it happened in our own backyard.
Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
In the heart of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, where the Atlantic wind whistles through the saltgrass and the dunes shift like restless ghosts, lies one of the most haunting enigmas in American history: the disappearance of the Roanoke Colony.
About 115 men, women, and children, along with John White, the governor, arrived off the coast of North Carolina.
For over 4 centuries, historians, archaeologists, and storytellers have been captivated by the fate of more than 100 English settlers who vanished from the island without a trace. They left behind a single word carved into a tree: CROATOAN, and centuries of speculation.
And the letter C-R-O carved into a tree.
Recently, scientists employing the tools of modern genetics, advanced satellite imaging, and meticulous archaeological study have pieced together what may finally be the truth about what happened to those men, women, and children. The revelation not only uncovers the destiny of the colonists, but also forces a profound rethinking of early American history, indigenous relations, and the fragile line between survival and extinction on the edges of empire. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The story begins in the late 16th century, a time when England, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, sought to establish a foothold in the New World. The Spanish dominated much of the Americas, their galleons laden with gold from conquered empires, and the English crown longed for a piece of that vast, unexplored wealth. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of the Queen, envisioned a self-sufficient English colony on the coast of the New World. In 1585, an initial expedition under Ralph Lane landed on Roanoke Island, chosen for its defensible position and proximity to the sea. Yet from the start, misfortune shadowed the venture. Supplies dwindled, relations with nearby Native American tribes soured, and disease ravaged the small outpost. When ships arrived later that year, most of the settlers chose to return to England, their dreams of a new world retreating like the tide. Undeterred, Raleigh planned a second attempt, one that would include families, craftsmen, and farmers rather than just soldiers and adventurers. In 1587, over 100 settlers, led by Governor John White, sailed for Roanoke. Among them was White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, who gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. The colonists set about rebuilding their lives in the wild, clearing land, constructing homes, and sowing the seeds of a new beginning. Yet the environment proved unforgiving. Drought crippled their crops, and the uneasy truce with nearby tribes quickly frayed. Recognizing the colony's dire need for supplies, White sailed back to England, intending to return swiftly. But the seas of the Atlantic were treacherous, and England itself soon became embroiled in the Armada crisis with Spain. 3 years passed before White could return. When he did, he found the settlement deserted. The fort stood silent, the houses dismantled, and there were no signs of struggle or bodies. Only the word CROATOAN remained, carved into a post, as if a message left for those who would come after. For centuries, the mystery of Roanoke endured. Did the settlers starve, massacred by hostile tribes? Did they attempt to sail home and perish at sea? Or had they, as the word suggested, joined the CROATOAN people, the Native Americans of nearby Hatteras Island, and assimilated into their culture? Without concrete evidence, the story became a ghostly riddle. Theories multiplied like branches of an old oak, each plausible, none conclusive. But as the 21st century dawned, science offered new ways to listen to the whispers of the past. Archaeologists returned to Roanoke and Hatteras armed not with shovels alone, but with ground-penetrating radar, carbon dating, and DNA sequencing. The land itself, which had long kept its secrets buried beneath centuries of sand and forest, began to yield them at last. The first breakthrough came from the soil. Fragments of European pottery found on Hatteras Island, distinct from the crude, utilitarian ceramics of the native inhabitants. These were not trade goods, as some had long assumed, but domestic wares typical of 16th century England. Alongside them lay the rusted remains of tools and weapon parts, their design unmistakably Elizabethan. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from genetic studies conducted among the descendants of the Lumbee and Croatan peoples of North Carolina. Using mitochondrial DNA, Scientists traced lineages that bore unexpected markers of European ancestry far older than the colonial influx of the 17th century. The genetic fingerprints suggested that intermarriage between the Roanoke settlers and local tribes had indeed occurred, preserving a biological echo of their existence long after their disappearance from written records. This discovery altered everything. It painted a picture not of annihilation, but of adaptation. The colonists, stranded without resupply, likely turned to the only option available: alliance and integration with their indigenous neighbors. To survive, they would have had to adopt native ways, learning to hunt, fish, and farm in unfamiliar terrain, to speak new tongues, and to live within the rhythms of tribal society. The CROATOAN people, for their part, may have seen advantage in adopting the Englishmen. Their iron tools, their knowledge of carpentry and fortification, their weapons, and their curiosity about trade. What emerged was not the erasure of one culture by another, but a merging, fragile, tentative, and remarkable. The so-called lost colony was never lost, only transformed beyond recognition by the demands of survival. Further analysis of artifacts deepened this view. At two key sites, one on Hatteras Island and another inland near the Albemarle Sound, researchers unearthed evidence suggesting that the colonists may have split into separate groups. Some appear to have gone south toward Croatoan territory, while others moved inland to seek friendlier ground and more abundant resources. The inland site, known as Site X, yielded shards of English pottery alongside native items from the same period, indicating sustained coexistence. This dual migration pattern would explain why no single location bore the full weight of their remains. The settlers scattered and absorbed, left behind no city, no grave, no single monument to mark their end. The implications of this discovery are profound. It challenges the traditional narrative of early colonization as a simple tale of conquest and dominance. Instead, it reveals a moment of cultural fusion at the very dawn of America's colonial experience. The Roanoke settlers, far from being passive victims of misfortune, became participants in a cross-cultural experiment, one that blurred the boundaries between European and native identity. The resulting legacy may well have influenced later generations of both peoples, subtly shaping language, customs, and even physical traits across the Carolina coast. In this light, the word Croatoan takes on new meaning. Long regarded as a cryptic clue, it may have been neither a plea for rescue nor a sign of defeat, but a declaration, a statement of where they had gone and who they had become. It was not a word of despair but of transition. The colonists may have carved it not as a message to a rescuer, but as an assertion of belonging, an acknowledgement of the new community they were joining. It symbolized the birth of an identity that was neither wholly English nor wholly indigenous, but something in between, a hybrid seed of the American story. The scientific unraveling of Roanoke's mystery also forces historians to reconsider the broader context of colonization. For centuries, the Roanoke episode was framed as a failure, a lost endeavor that warned of the perils of New World exploration. Yet in truth, the colonists' assimilation may represent a different kind of success, the triumph of adaptation over arrogance. Unlike later colonies that sought to impose European systems upon native lands, the people of Roanoke survived by relinquishing the illusion of dominance. They learned quite literally to live as the land demanded. In doing so, they became the first Europeans in North America to truly integrate with indigenous societies, centuries before assimilation became a policy or a weapon. The revelation also reignites discussion about the human dimensions of the mystery, the personal stories behind the collective fate. Imagine Eleanor Dare, holding her infant daughter beneath the Carolina pines, watching the ship carrying her father disappear beyond the horizon. The months turning into years, hope giving way to resignation, and finally the decision to move, to trust the Croatoans, to exchange English walls for native shelters, linen garments for deerskin, and prayers for stories told beside the fire. Each step away from Roanoke was a step away from England itself, from the safety of identity and the certainties of home. Yet in that loss there was also a rebirth, a chance to create something enduring in the wilderness. That human resilience, the willingness to adapt rather than perish, may be the true heart of the Roanoke saga. As scientists piece together the evidence, They found the landscape itself still bearing the marks of those encounters. Satellite imaging revealed faint geometric patterns beneath the forest floor, traces of structures long decayed but aligned in ways that matched early English fortifications. Soil samples contained remnants of European crops, their pollen embedded deep in sediment layers corresponding to the late 16th century. Even microscopic analysis of metal residues showed smelting techniques consistent with Elizabethan metallurgy. Each discovery, like a puzzle piece long misplaced, slotted neatly into the emerging picture of survival and transformation. The technology used to uncover these truths represents a revolution in historical inquiry. Where earlier generations relied on written records and surface archaeology, today's researchers harness the power of genetics, isotopic analysis, and artificial intelligence to reconstruct lost histories. The Roanoke investigation became a showcase of this multidisciplinary approach, combining anthropology, chemistry, climatology, and data science to weave together a narrative from traces so faint they might once have seemed invisible. This method, applied elsewhere, promises to illuminate countless other forgotten corners of human history, from vanished tribes to lost cities. Yet it is perhaps fitting that its most evocative success lies in the rediscovery of America's first mystery. What this new understanding also underscores is the complexity of first contact between Europeans and Native Americans. Far from being a one-sided story of domination, the early years of English exploration were marked by mutual curiosity, cooperation, and, sometimes, shared struggle. The Roanoke settlers were neither conquerors nor victims, but intermediaries. Their disappearance into native societies blurs the line between colonizer and colonized. It suggests that the earliest chapters of American identity were written not in isolation but in exchange, in the quiet merging of worlds at the edge of empire. There is also an ecological dimension to the story that modern science has made clear. Core samples taken from the island's marshes show that the years surrounding the colony's disappearance coincided with one of the most severe droughts in a millennium. The settlers, unaccustomed to the region's volatile climate, would have faced crop failure, disease, and scarcity. This environmental catastrophe likely pushed them toward the CROATOAN people, who had long mastered the cycles of the land. The partnership that followed may have been born not only of necessity, but of reverence. A recognition that survival in the New World required humility before its natural forces. In that sense, the story of Roanoke is also a parable about humanity's relationship with nature. That survival depends not on conquest, but on coexistence. The discovery's resonance extends beyond the historical or scientific. It speaks to a deeper truth about identity and belonging. The colonists who merged with the CROATOANs forged a community that defied the rigid boundaries of race, culture, and nation that would later dominate the colonial era. Their descendants, if one follows the genetic and linguistic evidence, carried forward a blend of traditions: English carpentry and native craft, European storytelling and indigenous myth, Old World prayers and New World songs. This hybrid heritage, long unacknowledged, prefigures the cultural tapestry that would come to define America itself. It suggests that the nation's origins are more entwined, more inclusive, and more complex than the linear narratives of conquest often imply. Archaeologists studying the sites associated with Roanoke have described a sense of intimacy in their work, a feeling that they are not just unearthing artifacts, but listening to echoes. A small copper ring, a piece of glass from a mirror, a musket flint. Each item tells of ordinary lives suspended between worlds. One can imagine the colonists learning new ways to tan hides, to weave baskets, to navigate by the stars rather than by compass. Children born of mixed heritage running along the beaches of Hatteras, their hair the color of sunlit sand, their words a blend of two languages. In those unseen moments, the Roanoke mystery transforms from a tale of disappearance to one of persistence, not of death, but of transformation through adaptation. For the scientists and historians who finally pieced together the truth, the emotional impact was profound. Decades, even centuries of conjecture had painted Roanoke as a tragedy, a failed dream. The revelation that the settlers survived, that they lived on in another form, reframes the entire episode as one of endurance and reinvention. It reveals that the story of America did not begin solely with Jamestown or Plymouth, but with a group of men and women who learned to shed the rigid boundaries of their homeland and embrace a new way of life in a foreign land. The myth of the lost colony thus becomes something greater, a testament to human adaptability, courage, and the power of cultural fusion. The revelation surrounding the fate of the Roanoke Colony not only satisfies an old historical curiosity, but redefines how we understand the human capacity for reinvention in the face of despair. When the scientists and historians pieced together the genetic, archaeological, and environmental clues that illuminated the colonists' integration into the CROATOAN and related tribes, the narrative of disappearance transformed into one of persistence. Yet beyond the physical evidence and scientific validation lies a deeper philosophical and cultural reckoning, one that reaches into the very roots of American identity. The Roanoke settlers were not merely victims of isolation or misfortune. They were participants in the first experiment of coexistence between radically different civilizations on the continent. This realization expands the meaning of their legacy and hints at an even larger story, one about the merging of worlds that would shape the centuries to come. The Roanoke settlers had arrived with dreams of establishing an English Eden. Their vision, shaped by the ambitions of empire and the lure of profit, was also deeply spiritual. England's colonization project was cloaked in divine purpose, the idea that expansion westward was a sacred mission, a duty to bring faith, order, and civilization to lands seen as untamed. But the wilderness of the Carolina coast, with its dense forests, relentless storms, and unfamiliar wildlife, refused to conform to those dreams. The settlers quickly learned that the land demanded humility, not dominion. The sea that had brought them across the Atlantic became a barrier to return, and the forests that surrounded them both sheltered and confined. Their survival required a new form of wisdom, not one drawn from English custom or royal charter, but from the earth itself and the people who knew it best. This process of learning was, in many ways, an unmaking. Each day stripped away a layer of Englishness, of the social hierarchies, rituals, and beliefs that had defined their world. The colonists who turned toward the Croatoans did so not as conquerors, but as supplicants. They had to abandon the pretense of superiority and learn to live as part of a community whose values and rhythms differed completely from their own. The Croatoans, for their part, would have faced a decision of equal significance, whether to see the newcomers as enemies, burdens, or potential kin. The act of acceptance on both sides represented an unprecedented moment in early colonial history. Two civilizations meeting not through war or subjugation, but through necessity, trust, and shared endurance. Archaeological findings suggest that this integration was gradual rather than sudden. The colonists may have first sought refuge temporarily, expecting white or another English fleet to return for them. But as seasons passed, crops failed, and years slipped by without rescue, the reality of their abandonment settled in. The choice to remain with the Croatoans, to intermarry, to adopt their ways, became not merely a survival strategy but an existential transformation. Over time, the settlers' tools, language, and customs blended with native practices. English metalwork was repurposed for native crafts. European weaving techniques merged with indigenous textile traditions, and new forms of storytelling emerged, combining oral legends with English folklore. What began as a desperate alliance evolved into the birth of a hybrid society, one that quietly persisted long after England had written the colonists off as lost. From a cultural perspective, this union stands as a symbolic counterpoint to the narratives that dominated later centuries of colonization. In Jamestown, the English established a settlement built on hierarchy, trade, and militarized defense. The Roanoke experiment, by contrast, appears to have dissolved those structures. There was no rigid chain of command, no fortifications built to enforce control. Instead, survival depended on collaboration, flexibility, and a willingness to adapt. In that sense, the Roanoke settlers became the first Europeans in the Americas to experience true cultural immersion, a voluntary surrender of identity in exchange for life. They crossed a threshold that few of their successors would even consider. Where later colonies sought to preserve the distinctions between Englishmen and native, the Roanoke settlers, out of necessity, erased them. Modern anthropologists studying the implications of this assimilation argue that it may have influenced local tribal structures as well. The arrival of English settlers with their tools, knowledge of shipbuilding, and foreign plants introduced subtle shifts in indigenous economies. The CROATOANs and their neighbors began to incorporate new materials into their daily lives, adapting them in innovative ways that suited their environment. At the same time, the English colonists would have absorbed native philosophies, especially regarding land, community, and spirituality. In indigenous culture, survival was a collective act rooted in reciprocity, not ownership. For people who came from a world defined by property and class, this perspective would have been transformative. The exchange between these groups was therefore not one-sided. It created a dynamic relationship that reshaped both. The scientists' reconstruction of this shared existence has also reignited interest in the linguistic possibilities that emerged from such contact. It is likely that a pidgin language, a blend of English and Algonquian dialects, developed as the two communities learned to communicate. Over generations, this linguistic fusion may have evolved into a Creole of its own, now long vanished, but perhaps still faintly echoed in regional vocabulary and oral histories. Language, being both fragile and tenacious, often preserves traces of encounters long forgotten by written record. The possibility that words or phrases used by later coastal tribes carried fragments of Elizabethan English underscores the depth of the colonists' integration. Beyond language and genetics, the psychological journey of the Roanoke settlers is perhaps the most compelling dimension of the story. To imagine their existence after the first year is to enter a space of liminality, suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. They were no longer purely English, but not yet wholly native. This in-between state would have shaped their worldview in profound ways. Freed from the constraints of European society, but burdened by the memory of it, they may have developed new ways of seeing themselves and the land around them. The wilderness, once an adversary, became a teacher. The people once labeled savages became family. Over time, their identity as colonists faded into something entirely new, something that had no name in the vocabulary of their era. This transformation carries deep implications for the concept of civilization itself. The disappearance of the Roanoke Colony has long been viewed as a failure of European endurance, a symbol of the Old World's inability to impose itself upon the new. Yet, from another angle, it represents an evolution of civilization rather than its collapse. The colonists did not vanish. They transcended their own definitions of community and culture. They achieved what later explorers, merchants, and conquerors could not: genuine integration with the land and its people. If history is often written by those who build empires, then the Roanoke settlers stand as an unwritten chapter of another kind of history, one where survival depended not on conquest, but on surrender. Such surrender required not weakness, but extraordinary strength. For individuals accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of Tudor England, where birth determined destiny and conformity meant safety, the New World stripped away all illusion of control. Every rule and expectation they had known ceased to function. It was a world governed not by titles, but by weather, by hunger, and by trust. This forced humility likely reshaped the settlers' understanding of faith and destiny. Where once they might have seen themselves as emissaries of divine order, they would now have seen their existence as part of a larger living balance. The spiritual exchange between the English and the CROATOANs may have been one of the earliest moments of mutual religious curiosity in North America. The Christian settlers, deprived of priests and churches, would have found spiritual meaning in native rituals of gratitude and reverence for the earth, while the CROATOANs, encountering the settlers' stories of their distant god, may have absorbed fragments of Christian cosmology into their own mythic frameworks. The scientists who uncovered these connections often described feeling a sense of poetic justice in the findings. For centuries, the story of Roanoke had been told as a cautionary tale, a symbol of hubris punished by nature. Now it stands as evidence of the very qualities that define human endurance: adaptability, empathy, and the ability to build bridges across cultures. The colonists' integration into native society was not a failure of colonization, but an act of evolution. They ceased to be agents of empire and became instead part of the fabric of a new world. If one considers the broader historical context, this transformation also casts light on the origins of American hybridity. The blending of peoples that began on the shores of Roanoke prefigured the multicultural complexity that would come to define the continent. It is a reminder that the earliest foundations of what would become the United States were not built solely on English soil transplanted abroad, but on the meeting and mingling of disparate worlds. Long before the language of melting pots and pluralism entered political rhetoric, it was lived, quietly, organically, in the lives of those forgotten settlers who chose coexistence over extinction. Environmental factors played a continuing role in shaping this story. The coastal region of North Carolina in the late 16th century was not only ecologically rich, but volatile. Drought cycles, shifting sandbars, and seasonal hurricanes constantly reshaped the landscape. The settlers' decision to relocate or disperse was not simply a cultural one, it was also ecological. The CROATOANs understood these rhythms intimately: when to move camps, how to read the tides, where to find freshwater sources during lean years. By adopting such practices, the English colonists would have learned the art of living with rather than against nature. In a way, they became early practitioners of what modern environmentalists might call sustainability. They survived by listening to the land. From a scientific standpoint, the study of pollen and soil layers in the Roanoke region provided striking confirmation of this adaptation. Evidence of introduced European plants found alongside native species from the same era suggests that the colonists may have experimented with hybrid agriculture, combining English crops with indigenous farming methods. Such innovation would have required cooperation and shared knowledge, further proof of how deeply intertwined the two communities became. These traces, invisible to the eye but enduring in the earth, tell a story of learning and exchange that no document could record. The cultural ripple of the Roanoke integration likely extended far beyond the immediate region. Trade networks among coastal tribes meant that tools, materials, and even stories traveled across distances. A musket flint or metal blade traded inland may have carried with it the tale of the pale-faced people who had become part of the Croatoan world. Over time, these stories would evolve into legend, the myth of strangers who came from the sea and were absorbed into the people of the land. Such myths, passed down through generations, form the oral counterpart to archaeology's physical record. They are history encoded in memory rather than text, and they suggest that the colonists' influence, though diffuse, never entirely vanished. From a moral perspective, the Roanoke story also invites reflection on the very meaning of discovery. The European worldview of the 16th century equated discovery with possession. To discover a place was to claim it. Yet in the case of Roanoke, discovery ultimately led to belonging rather than ownership. The colonists, stripped of imperial backing, found themselves learning what it meant to live in reciprocity rather than dominance. In that sense, they achieved a kind of enlightenment centuries ahead of their time. Theirs was not the conquest of a new world, but the rediscovery of humanity's oldest truth, that survival depends on connection, not control. The implications of this revelation ripple through the modern understanding of history. For generations, textbooks and scholars presented colonization as a linear progression: discovery, settlement, expansion, and nationhood. The Roanoke story disrupts that sequence. It reveals an alternate path, one that diverged from the trajectory of empire and entered the realm of mutual adaptation. If history had remembered Roanoke differently, the moral imagination of colonization itself might have evolved differently. The story could have served as a model of cultural partnership rather than a cautionary tale. The rediscovery of its true nature, therefore, not only resolves an ancient mystery, but also reopens a question that remains vital today. What does it mean to inhabit a land rather than to own it? Among historians and anthropologists, this realization has spurred renewed debate about the ethics of memory. For centuries, the narrative of Roanoke was framed entirely through an English lens, as a story of English loss, English failure, English mystery. The new evidence restores agency to the Croatoans and other indigenous peoples who shaped the outcome. The colonists did not simply vanish. They were welcomed, taught, and transformed by a culture that Western history had long relegated to the margins. To acknowledge this is to correct a profound imbalance, to recognize that the survival of the first English colonists in America owed everything to the generosity and knowledge of the people they once deemed primitive. The scientists who confirmed this connection have thus done more than solve a mystery. They have restored dignity to voices that were never silent, only unheard. Within the local communities of modern North Carolina, this understanding has taken on living significance. Families who trace mixed heritage through the Lumbee and Croatan lineages now see in the Roanoke story a reflection of their own history, a tangible link to the moment when two worlds intertwined. Oral traditions that once seemed like folklore now find validation in genetic evidence and archaeological discovery. The word CROATOAN, once a cryptic mark of loss, has become a symbol of endurance and union. It stands as a reminder that history's greatest mysteries often conceal stories of resilience rather than tragedy. The scientific unraveling of the Roanoke mystery also opens new pathways for studying the formation of hybrid cultures worldwide. Similar processes occurred wherever Europeans first made contact with indigenous peoples, in South America, the Pacific, and Africa, but rarely with such complete absorption as in Roanoke. The lessons drawn from this episode extend far beyond the American context. They remind us that history's great movements are not always driven by conquest or discovery, but by the quiet, invisible acts of adaptation that occur when individuals choose to live rather than dominate. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on scientists finally solving the Roanoke mystery? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.